Okay, thanks everyone for your patience. It's a little afternoon Mountain Time, so we'll go ahead and get started. Welcome everyone, and thank you for joining us for today's webinar. I'm Megan Kevel, co-coordinator for the Northern Rockies Fire Science Network. In case you are unfamiliar with the network, we are one of 15 regional fire science exchanges funded by the Joint Fire Science Program. The Northern Rockies Fire Science Network delivers science and provides opportunities for engagement between managers and scientists about critical fire and fuels topics in the region. To learn more about resources and opportunities we provide, you can visit our website at nrfirescience.org. So on behalf of our team and our partners, I want to welcome all of you to today's webinar titled Climatic Controls on Post-Fire Regeneration and Growth in Ponderosa Pine and Douglas-fir, presented by Dr. Kim Davis. Before introducing Kim, I'll review a couple of webinar housekeeping items. All attendees are in listen-only mode for this webinar, but you can ask questions of myself or our presenter at any time by typing them into the chat pane of the webinar control panel on your screen. These questions will be addressed at the end and can help facilitate discussion following the presentation. Whatever you do in your control panel does not affect the presentation or anyone else, so feel free to type a test message or test your audio at any time during the presentation. A recording of this webinar will be available on the Northern Rockies Fire Science Network website and YouTube channel shortly after the live webinar. All webinar attendees will also receive an email with a link to that recording once it's available online. So with those logistics out of the way, I'll move on with introducing our presenter, Kim. Kim Davis is a postdoctoral scientist at the W.A. Franke College of Forestry and Conservation at the University of Montana. Kim's research focuses on understanding how global change affects plant communities, concentrating specifically on interactions among disturbance, invasive species, and climate. Recently, she has been examining how low elevation forests in the Western U.S. respond to wildfire and climate change. And with that, I'll hand this over to you, Kim. Thanks so much for being here today, and go ahead and begin whenever you're ready.
Okay, thanks, Megan, and thanks everybody for being here. And with that, I can start. So first of all, I just wanted to acknowledge and thank all of the many collaborators that I have. I'll be presenting on a couple of different studies, and so I've had collaborators from the University of Montana, from the Forest Service, from the University of Colorado Boulder, and also from the University of Idaho. And funding for this work has come from the Joint Fire Science Program and also from NSF. So increasingly, managers and scientists are both thinking about how resilient our forests in the Western US will be to changes in both fire and climate. And so when we have an area like this that's burned, what we're interested in is what's going to happen after the fire. So if the forest is resilient, then we would expect that following the fire, we would see a lot of tree regeneration, and over time this forest might return to a similar type of forest as it was prior to the fire. And this is what we expect to occur in most of our forests in the West. The conifer forests have, evolved with fire, and fire has been an important part of these ecosystems. So typically we do see regeneration following fire. However, it's also possible that we might see areas where we don't see any tree regeneration following fire. And this is what we're interested in trying to figure out why is it that we're not seeing tree regeneration. And so if we zoom in on this type of landscape where we see that it was clearly a forest prior to the fire, and then we had this high severity patch right here, there's a couple of reasons why we might not be seeing regeneration. So first of all, there might not be a seed source. And so in really large high severity patches, if you're 300 yards away from the nearest edge, there might not be enough seeds for the trees to regenerate. However, in this case, we do have a seed source, and we still didn't see any regeneration even near the edge of the forest, the unburned forest there. And so what we were interested in is trying to figure out what's the role of climate, because this is the next thing that might be limiting tree regeneration. And the reason that we're interested in climate is because every tree species has specific climate tolerances. So for example, we can represent this by this blue oval, and you can see that here we have the climate space that a hypothetical species might be able to exist in. in terms of temperature and precipitation. But what we also know is that juveniles are much more sensitive to climate than adults. And this is because these little seedlings, they have really short roots, so they can't get down to the deeper soil water. They're also really sensitive to high temperatures right near the surface, which can girdle them and cause them to die. And so typically we talk about this regeneration niche, which is the smaller climate tolerances of these juveniles. And so what can happen is that because trees are so long-lived, we can have adults that establish, for example, out here with hotter temperatures and lower precipitation currently than what juveniles can tolerate. But because the trees are so old, the climate conditions were different when they regenerated. So it used to be cool and wet enough for these trees, but now the conditions are no longer suitable for regeneration. And it's these areas where we would expect, if we had a fire, a high severity fire that killed the adults, that we might not see regeneration following the fire. But we don't know is exactly what this defines this yellow oval, like where exactly is this climate space and what conditions do juveniles need to regenerate. Additionally, following fire, we can also have changes in the microclimate, or we would expect that we could have changes in the microclimate, which is just the very small scale temperature conditions right near the ground surface where these trees are regenerating. So when we lose the canopy cover, even if we had trees regenerating prior to the fire, we might not have trees regenerating following the fire. And so what we were really interested in was first trying to figure out exactly how annual climate affects post-fire recruitment. And so there have been other studies that have looked at 30-year mean climate conditions and how that relates to post-fire density, with the finding that generally drier sites tend to have lower post-fire tree regeneration. But what we were really interested in was what exactly are the conditions in the years following fire that are necessary to have this tree regeneration occur. Following that, we also were interested in then, if these trees establish, how does climate affect how well they're growing? And then finally, what we wanted to figure out was how might wildfire alter the microclimate near the ground level? And so we'll start out with those first two questions. So we focus specifically on Ponderosa pine and Douglas-fir, which I'm sure everyone is aware are two of the most dominant, widespread, low elevation tree species in the Western US. We had study sites in 4 regions, so in the Northern Rockies, in the Front Range of Colorado, in the Southwest, and then in Northern California. And what we did is in each one of these regions, we went to areas that had burned between 1988 and 2007. And we selected our sites to be in the hottest and driest areas where these two species were existing. So the work that I'm presenting is really representative of kind of the hot, dry edge of this type of forest, not the entire range of these species. And what we wanted to do was figure out what were the conditions like when these trees that we found that established following the fire, what were the climate conditions like in the years when those trees did establish? And to do this, what we needed to do was to age a bunch of trees. And so we destructively sampled seedlings at all of our sites, or seedlings also through to juvenile or sapling stage trees. So any tree that had established following the fire. So in some of the oldest fires, the trees that we sampled were up to 25 years old. And then we took them back to the lab and we aged them under the microscope. And so there are good ways to estimate tree age in the field by counting bud scars or using branch whorls. But these methods don't get to exact annual precision. So you might estimate the age within a couple of years. But what we wanted to know was what was the exact year that this tree germinated so that we could compare it to the climate conditions that happened during that year. And so what we did is we cut up each one of our trees right across the root shoot boundary, and we aged each one of those segments so that we could be sure we were getting the exact year that each tree germinated. And so we did this for almost 3,000 trees, which you can imagine was a really time-intensive process, but we got a lot of really great information from this process. So for example, what we had for each one of our 90 sites was what we call an age structure. And so shown here is the germination year on the x-axis, and then on the y we have the proportion or the percent of the trees that recruited at that site that recruited in each year. So for example, in 2009, we had almost 50% of our trees that we found at that site had recruited in 2009. And this red line is the year of the fire. So you can see there's a gap at this site between when we had the fire and when we saw a lot of the trees recruiting. And so then what we were really interested in is what's explaining this variability that we see. You know, we don't have recruitment some years, we have a lot of recruitment other years, and then we see that recruitment just stops. And so we wanted to try to figure out what's explaining that variability. And so the variables that we used to try to figure this out were both climate and non-climatic predictors. So we used a model, and the response in the model was whether or not we had recruitment. So for each year we said, yes, we have recruitment, or no, we don't. And then we compare that to the summer, June through August vapor pressure deficit, which is a measure of atmospheric water demand. So basically, how dry is the air? It's similar to humidity, and how much is that air pulling water out of these seedlings? So high levels of VPD, it's generally more stressful for seedlings. We also looked at the maximum surface temperature, so the temperature right at the ground level, and this was the hottest that it got in any single day across the entire season. So this is really just the daily maximum surface temperature. So really short time scales, these climate variables that we're looking at. Then we also looked at the spring soil moisture, which was the average from March to May, and then the soil moisture of the driest month, which varied by region, which month was the driest. And then we also included these other factors that we know affect post-fire regeneration. So time since fire, distance to seed source, and fire severity. So we want to control for these factors while trying to figure out what's the relationship between climate and regeneration. And so what we found was that the relationship between annual climate and the probability of regeneration is very nonlinear. Or in other words, we see these thresholds beyond which we see a big change in recruitment probability. So just looking at this example for Ponderosa pine, we see that as summer vapor pressure deficit increases here on the X, we see a big decline in recruitment probability. So we can say that this dashed line represents a threshold, and once this threshold is crossed, we see a big reduction in the probability of recruitment. Similarly, for soil moisture of the driest month, once we get to a certain point of higher soil moisture, then we saw a big increase in the recruitment probability. This is for Ponderosa pine. For Douglas-fir, the two most important climate variables were different. So the first one was maximum surface temperature. And so again, this is the temperature right at the ground level. So the threshold we found was around 120 degrees Fahrenheit, which sounds really hot, but it does regularly get to this high temperatures right at the ground surface, especially in these warmer, drier parts of these tree species ranges. So then similarly, we saw that recruitment probability drops once we cross that threshold. And then, for Douglas-fir, it was spring soil moisture that was most important. And so with increasing spring soil moisture, we see an increase in recruitment probability, as we would expect. And so these results aren't too surprising that these factors would matter for recruitment, but we were surprised by how dramatic these thresholds were. Instead of just seeing, what we see with spring soil moisture is a little bit more of a linear relation, gradual relationship. And so now that we had identified these thresholds, what we are interested in was how do these temperature and soil moisture thresholds compare to the actual conditions that we've seen at our sites over the past 35 years. And so what we can do is take this relationship that we got from our model and take this threshold and put it on to this plot on the right, which is showing the time series of the mean summer vapor pressure deficit at each of our sites from 1980 to 2015. So each one of these lines represents one of the regions, and it's the mean for all of the sites within that region. So between 10 and 40 sites, depending on the region. And these dots at the bottom are when these conditions drop below the threshold. So this is years when the climate conditions or when the summer vapor pressure deficit is low enough that we would expect to see recruitment. And so what you'll notice is that prior to 2000, we have plenty of dots and we would expect to see recruitment in most of our regions periodically. However, after 2000, we really see a decline in the frequency of good years with suitable climate for regeneration. And so this agrees with what we see on the landscape. You know, we're aware that Ponderosa tends to have episodic recruitment, and especially at the lower limits of its range, we wouldn't expect that every year is suitable, but really what we're seeing now is that almost no years are suitable. We see a similar but less dramatic trend for Douglas-fir. When we look at the maximum surface temperature, what we see is that California is already really hot. However, especially in the Northern Rockies and also to some extent in the Southwest, the temperatures have increased over time. And so again, after about 2000, we're definitely seeing a decline in the years that have these cooler temperatures that are more conducive to tree regeneration. So these are just two examples of two of the climate variables that mattered for Douglas-fir and Ponderosa pine, but for each species there were multiple climate variables that contributed to trying to predict their recruitment probability. So the way that we tried to then look at how the predicted recruitment probability has changed over time is we used our model to backcast the probability of recruitment for every year from 1980 to 2015 based on the climate conditions at each one of our sites, while holding other things like distance to seed source, fire severity, and time since fire constant. So what this represents is the probability of recruitment in any given year, assuming it's the year after fire, there's a seed source available, and so really the variability that we see here is just a measure of climate suitability. And so what you can see again for Ponderosa pine is that we do have plenty of years that have suitable climate for recruitment prior to 2000, but after 2000 we see a pretty dramatic decline in the number of years that do have this good climate condition suitable for regeneration, with the exception of Colorado, where we still see a few big peaks. And that's because we saw an increase in the variability in climate at our sites in Colorado. For Douglas-fir, again, it's less clear than it was for Ponderosa pine, but what we do notice is that in the Northern Rockies especially, there's a decline over time. In California, there was no trend, and in the Southwest, there's statistically a decline, but really, you know, it's maybe less clear-cut than it is in the Northern Rockies. And so overall, these findings are really exciting because we're able to link climate change to what we're observing on the ground. I shouldn't say exciting. It's not exciting that climate is becoming less suitable, but it's providing an explanation for some of these observations that both managers and scientists have been making, that we're seeing less tree regeneration following fire. And what this is showing is that in our warmest and driest sites, it's probably a result of a change in the climate conditions. However, in our models, we also included these other variables, as I mentioned. And so I just wanted to point out that other variables were also really important in predicting and explaining tree regeneration. And so what this plot is showing is the relative influence of each of these variables on the probability of regeneration for each of the species. So what you'll notice is that this big green area for Ponderosa pine is seed source. So as most of us are aware, and a lot of other studies have found, the distance to the nearest seed source is really important in determining whether or not we see Ponderosa pine regeneration following fire. Even when we were accounting for seed source, we still found that fire severity was also important for Ponderosa pine, and we saw a decline in regeneration potential when we had higher fire severity. And so this could be due to other factors like microclimate, which I'll talk about next, and then also potentially changes to soils that might happen, or an increase in shrubs, which also happens with high severity fire in some regions, like in California, for example. On the other hand, for Douglas-fir, we also found distance to seed source was important, but really what we saw was that time since fire was the most important driver in whether or not we had recruitment in a given year. And so in California and in the Southwest in particular, what we saw was that Douglas-fir regeneration happened mostly within 3 years following fire. And so it was really a strong pulse right after the fire, and then we really didn't see any regeneration after that. Which is different than what we saw in the Northern Rockies, where we tended to have longer periods of regeneration, up to 10 or 15 years following the fire. So if we come back to our initial question, how does annual climate affect post-fire recruitment? What we were able to find was that warm and dry conditions are in fact limiting regeneration, and that in our warmest and driest forests, there may no longer be suitable climate conditions for regeneration. So again, we targeted the warmest and driest sites. So this isn't happening everywhere, but at the edges of these species ranges, this is definitely probably going to be happening more and more in the future after high severity fires. And then finally, again, what we also saw was that although annual climate was important, there is these other abiotic and biotic factors like fire severity or distance to seed source that were also important in determining whether or not we had post-fire regeneration. So now moving on to how annual climate might affect post-fire seedling growth. So this work was done by Lacey Hankin, who was a master's student in our lab here at the University of Montana. She graduated recently, and she took all of the seedlings that we used for the previous work that I was just talking about, and those sites are shown here with the plus signs. So she took those just from the Northern Rockies region, and then she also added about 10 or 15 more sites that had adult trees, and those are represented here by these triangles. And you can see they kind of span a similar range as the seedling sites. And these tree core sites had burned between 1900 and 1980. So this gave us more of a range of post-fire conditions and also the ability to look at adult and juvenile growth. Today I'm just going to focus on the juvenile growth following fire. And so what we mean by juvenile is the first 20 years of any tree's life. So for this tree, for example, she would have started at pith and for the first 20 years counted that as juvenile growth, and then after that counted that as adult growth. So we'll focus just on the first 20 years of these trees' lives and how annual climate is affecting how they're growing. And so what she did was she compared the ring width, so how much these trees are growing, to various annual climate variables. And so the first one is water deficit, which is just a measure of how dry the conditions are. So the higher the water deficit, the drier it is. And what this graph is showing is the slope of the relationship between water deficit and growth. And so here, when it's negative and when these circles are filled in, it means it was statistically significant. So there was a strong relationship. And when the slope is negative, it means that with drier conditions, there's less growth. And this was especially true for Ponderosa pine. And because she had sampled these older trees, she was able to look at how this relationship has changed over time. And so what we see is that this time period in the 1930s, when it was also pretty hot and dry, there was this negative relationship between growth and water deficit. And then again, recently, there has been a strong negative relationship for Ponderosa pine. So what we expect is that if these trees do establish following a fire, their growth will be limited by these dry years. Interestingly, for Douglas-fir, she only found this negative relationship in the 1930s and 40s. And recently, she didn't find a relationship. So there's a couple of reasons that this might be. Douglas-fir is more likely to potentially grow in more shaded areas, so maybe there's some kind of effect of the canopy or shrubs and moderating the microclimate, or yeah, so I'm not entirely sure why why else it could be, but overall recently at these sites anyway, water deficit has been less limiting for Douglas-fir juveniles than it has been for Ponderosa pine sites. In terms of temperature, she's found similar results. So when we had high maximum temperatures, we had less growth for Ponderosa pine, both again in this kind of 1940s period, and then again recently we've also seen this negative relationship. And for Douglas-fir, again, we saw that in the 30s and 40s there was a negative relationship, but recently there hasn't been much effect of maximum temperature on Douglas-fir juvenile growth. Finally, she also looked at minimum temperatures. What she found was that there is no relationship for Ponderosa pine, but for Douglas-fir, what she found was a positive relationship. So this actually suggests that with higher minimum temperatures, she was seeing more growth in these juveniles. So maybe they were limited by cooler temperatures or shorter growing seasons during this period before 1975. Recently, that hasn't been the case, so maybe as these areas are warming up, temperature is less limiting for their growth and they're able to grow more. So the management implications from both of these studies are really that Ponderosa pine and Douglas-fir forest might not recover following wildfires as they have in previous decades, particularly at the lower elevation, drier, hotter sites. Additionally, I know that most managers already consider things like aspect and slope, but this work just really emphasizes that those are important things to consider. The climate is important to consider when you are planting trees following fire. Additionally, because we did find that fire severity and distance to seed source were both important for post-fire regeneration, any kind of practices that help reduce the size of high severity patches will also have cause an increase in regeneration. So the next thing we were interested in was how might wildfire alter the microclimate? Because these climate conditions are so important for the seedlings, this is something that we thought was also very relevant. So I'll start talking about this with a study that we did just in areas that hadn't burned but had forest canopy cover or didn't have forest canopy cover, and then we'll move on into thinking more about the implications for fire. So this was a study that we did across Montana, Idaho, and Oregon. We had 6 sites that were in 3 general locations. So in the Oregon Coast Range, in the Dunn Experimental Forest, the Oregon State Experimental Forest. We had sites in the Bitterroot Mountains in the Clearwater National Forest, and then also in the Lubrict Experimental Forest here in Montana, which is the University of Montana's experimental forest. At each one of these areas, we had sites at low and high elevation. Within each one of our sites, what we had was a clearing, which tended to be a clear cut, and then forest with different levels of canopy surrounding the clearing. And so we put temperature and humidity sensors at 6 areas in the forest with different levels of canopy cover, and then also in the middle of the clearing, because we were interested in how canopy cover is altering the microclimate that's experienced by these seedlings or other organisms living near the forest floor. So we monitored temperature and humidity for 3 growing seasons at each one of these sites. And this is just to give you an idea of what that looked like. We had temperature sensors right at the ground level and then also at 2 meters above the ground level. These are radiation shields to protect the sensors so that they're not affected by being in the sun. And so then what we did was we compared the temperature in the forest to the temperature in the openings. And I'm going to focus on our results for the temperatures right at the ground level because that's most relevant for seedlings. What we found was that there was a huge difference in temperature at these same sites. The only difference was just canopy cover. There is up to 30 degrees Fahrenheit difference in temperature with an average difference of about 6 degrees Fahrenheit between these areas that were completely in the open and areas with any canopy cover. And so this difference includes sites, some of our sites had as low as about 10 or 15% canopy cover. So if we look at the difference just between areas with at least 50% canopy cover and a clearing, that was 9 degrees Fahrenheit. So really significant differences between these openings and these areas under the forest canopy. Again, we saw similar differences for minimum temperatures. It was warmer in the forest, and then for vapor pressure deficit, again, which is similar to humidity, it was much drier in the openings and a little bit moister in the forest. And so this suggests that conditions might be more conducive for seedlings or other organisms with some level of canopy cover. So what this means for seedlings regenerating after disturbance is that once we remove the canopy, the microclimate will be much more stressful for seedlings. But what we were interested in exactly how much more stressful, or what is the actual difference between an area burned, say, at low severity and an area burned at high severity. So what we did was using the model that we created from those other sites in Oregon, Montana, and Idaho. Then we took canopy cover from sites that we had sampled that had burned at moderate, high, or low severity, or unburned sites. And so this was over 200 plots that was across the Northern Rockies sampled by Carrie Kemp et al., and then also the sites that we sampled for the first part of this study. And what we did was we just looked at the range of canopy covers with these different levels of fire severity. And so you can see high fire severity has median canopy covers less than 20%. It's a little bit higher in moderate sites. And then in low severity sites, they have about 50% canopy cover, which is similar to these unburned areas that had on average about 60-something% canopy cover. So we plugged these canopy cover values into these models we had developed from our microclimate sensors to see what would be the difference in temperature between these different sites. And what we see is that these high severity areas, that level of canopy cover, which is probably just a result of some snags, that's not enough to buffer the temperature at all. So they're experiencing the same temperatures near the ground level that you would in a clear cut that doesn't have any canopy cover at all. We saw a little bit of buffering, so 1.5 degrees cooler in the moderate severity areas, whereas in low severity, we would expect it to be almost 7 degrees cooler, and in unburned areas, we'd expect it to be about 9 degrees cooler, right at the soil surface where these seedlings are. And so this is just showing that there's a pretty significant difference in the climate conditions at the ground level that these seedlings are experiencing between these high severity areas and areas that burned at low severity. And this is just accounting for canopy cover. So this is not even accounting for things like differences in the color of the soil or albedo. And so we are also now trying to look into what's the actual difference between areas that burned at high, moderate, or didn't burn at all. And so in the past years, so there's a bunch of big fires in Montana, I'm sure most of you are aware of in 2017. And so we've taken advantage of this to go out last summer and put out some microclimate sensors in the Lolo Peak fire right near Missoula. And so we paired our sites, unburned, moderate, and high severity patches all right next to each other on the same aspect, same elevation, and then we put these microclimate sensors right at the ground level. And what you can see is that over the summertime, so this is July 1st, the year right after the fire, the first year after the fire, through about mid-August, we see a pretty significant difference in the temperatures in the unburned site and the high and moderate sites. So this is almost 10 degrees Fahrenheit difference between the unburned areas and the areas burned at high severity. And so this is enough to probably have pretty big implications for whether or not these seedlings can regenerate. What we also found in terms of how the forest canopy buffers microclimate is that the wetter and more productive forests tended to buffer temperatures more. So because we sampled sites across elevations and from the Oregon through Montana, we had sites with different levels of moisture and productivity. What we saw was that these really productive forests, for example, in the western part of Washington and Oregon, they were more likely to buffer temperatures, whereas some of our drier forests, like in central Idaho, were less likely to buffer temperatures. And so these colors represent this index that we made called buffering capacity, but basically what it means is that where it's really dark blue, it means that it's much cooler in the forest across the whole growing season than in a clearing, whereas in these areas that are kind of yellowy, those areas, there isn't much difference between being in a forest understory and being outside of the forest. And that's both because these areas tended to have lower canopy cover, but they also were drier. And so what this means for fires is that these areas that are really good at buffering microclimate and have these really moist and cool understories tend to be subalpine forests or really wet forests. And these are the types of forests that also tend to burn at really high severity, just naturally. And so these areas are where we would expect, if we have a high severity fire, there to be the biggest difference in the microclimate following the fire from what was there before. So it might be especially hard for seedlings that are used to these more moist and cool understories to then regenerate in this area that is then a lot hotter and a lot drier following the fire. What we also found, or the other implication of this, is that as it becomes drier and warmer in the future, our forests will be less likely to buffer microclimate conditions. And so areas that are shown here in dark red is just areas that we would expect there to be a decline in the ability of these forests to buffer temperatures. And so in the future, we would expect that the understories of these wetter forests in some of our subalpine areas, they will be less moderate than they were in the past. So they might have higher temperatures and drier conditions than they have recently. So if we come again back to our main question, how does wildfire alter microclimate? Fires decrease canopy cover, which results in this big increase in maximum temperatures and in humidity or vapor pressure deficit right near the ground surface. And we're working on trying to figure out if there's additional effects besides just canopy cover due to changes in soil color or other factors. So if we bring these two studies together, there's some important combined implications. So if we, for example, take this relationship between recruitment probability and summer vapor pressure deficit that we saw for Ponderosa pine, and then we look at what's been happening to summer vapor pressure deficit across the western US, what this is showing is a trend from 1979 to 2013. So you can see that it's getting a lot drier. If we then compare the predictions for the future, by 2100, the summer vapor pressure deficit is expected to increase by 0.5 kilopascals. We can compare that to the difference that we saw between canopy cover of greater than 50% and no canopy cover, which is almost double the difference that we expect to see in the next 80 years. And so what this is just showing is that while climate change is important and it's definitely having impacts on whether or not trees will regenerate, changes in canopy cover due to fires or other disturbances can also be really significant and enough to push a site across these thresholds that we have identified. So there might be some sites where there is tree regeneration prior to the fire, but then following the fire, because of the loss of canopy cover, the climate conditions are just no longer suitable for regeneration. So overall, our main finding was that some of these low elevation forests that we sampled, so the hottest and driest low elevation forests that contain Ponderosa pine and Douglas-fir, have already crossed these climate thresholds that we found for recruitment. Additionally, when fires cause a loss of canopy cover, that might be enough to push these sites across climate thresholds if they weren't already across the threshold. So the combined impacts of larger and potentially more severe fires and climate change might result in either more episodic recruitment, so just recruitment in fewer years, or just complete recruitment failures in the hottest and driest sites. And so really there's a couple implications of our work for management. Again, I know this is something that's already widely done, but it just again emphasizes the importance of considering site conditions prior to planting, and if possible, planting in areas where there's a little bit of shelter. And I know, again, that's widely practiced, and then just targeting areas where there aren't any seed sources, but maybe they're cooler and moister. So for example, this is a photo of a north-facing slope that probably the climate conditions might be okay for trees to regenerate, but there's no seed source anywhere nearby, so there's no trees coming back. Additionally, any type of management that might reduce fire severity or the size of large high-severity patches will likely increase post-fire regeneration, both by maintaining a seed source, but also by keeping this cooler microclimate, by keeping some of that canopy cover there. And then finally, in some of the hottest and driest sites, we might just need to accept these transitions to non-forest vegetation because there's some sites that are probably too hot and too dry to even plant seedlings. I know that there's been some studies in the Southwest where they've looked at success rates of post-fire planting, and the average success rate was about 25% across their sites, and some of their sites they didn't even have any trees surviving. And so it just shows that it's definitely important to focus resources where we think the climate conditions would be most suitable for regeneration, so that we don't, because I know that everyone has a very limited budget, and so some areas we might just have to accept that they are transitioning to other types of vegetation. And along these lines are recently one of my collaborators, Phil Higuera, and a group of other collaborators that he's worked with, both social scientists and ecologists, they just came out with this paper that came out yesterday. It's open access, so it's freely available online, and it's talking about how to think about resilience in fire-prone landscapes by combining both human values and ecological science. And so this is a main figure. It's a framework to think about things like management when we know that our forests are becoming less resilient. And so what it's showing here is on the y-axis, the acceptability of a state change. And so this is really just totally determined by human values, management goals, local communities, what they want to see on the landscape. And then here on the x-axis, what we have is based on science, so the probability of a state change. So for example, our study shows that these low elevation sites that have crossed these thresholds, probability of a state change is probably very likely. If we have a fire, it's very likely that these areas won't have tree regeneration following fire. But then there's two different options that we can think about. So in some areas that might be okay, that it's likely to change, but we're just okay with that. And then we can just prepare for that and be ready for that to happen. But in other areas, it might be really unacceptable to have this change. So for example, maybe if it's a municipal watershed or somewhere where we really want to keep forest on the landscape, and in those areas, we might have to think about accepting these really high mitigation costs. So it might involve things like prior to a fire, maybe doing a lot of frequent prescribed fire and fuels treatments to really prevent that area from burning at high severity fire. Or if it's already burned, it might require planting multiple years because any given year the success might be low, but then if you keep planting over time, maybe you'll hit a wet year and have high survival rates. And so in this situation, it might be really costly to try to keep forest on the landscape, but maybe due to management goals or human values, that's what we want. On the other hand, there's other areas where maybe it would be okay to change, but it's unlikely to change, or neither. And so this is just a good, useful framework for thinking about management decisions in the future. And so with that, just thank you to all of our field assistants and collaborators and funding sources, and I'd be happy to take any questions.
Great. Thank you, Kim, so much for the really informative presentation. Yeah, we'll open it up for questions now. So again, if you have a question, please type it into the question or chat pane on your webinar control panel. While we give folks a second to submit questions, I'll mention one upcoming webinar that may be of interest to folks attending this one. On May 24th at 11 a.m. Mountain Time, we'll be hosting the webinar titled Unraveling the Complexity of Mixed Severity Fire Regimes, New Insights from 3 Rocky Mountain Ecosystems, and that'll be presented by Dr. Cameron Nafasi. And that page, registration page, is up on our website under upcoming events, so nrfirescience.org. So feel free to check that out. And we do have a question. Great presentation. Could you post a list of those sources you showed in your slides? So yes. So Kim, I'll get all those the papers that you used, that you covered in this talk, and we can link to those on the event page where we'll have this presentation also. So I'll make sure to get all those from you. And if there are any others that are relevant, we can get
Great,
those up
yeah.
as well.
And also just a note, so most of those papers are freely available, but the first one in PNAS won't be publicly available for free until a couple more months. So if you're interested in a PDF of that, just email me and I can send you a copy if you don't have access.
Great, thanks. And let's see. Oh, let's see if we have any others. I think people have a lot to chew on after such an interesting presentation. We'll give them one more second if anyone has any other questions. Let's see. Here we go. Here's one more for you, Kim. Did you look at the effect of fire severity on soil properties at study sites and possible related effects on regeneration success?
We did not. Part of the reason why is because we were going to these sites at least 10 years following the fire, because we wanted to have enough time to look at various climate conditions in those 10 years following fire. But we are working on a new study with a grad student in our lab who is looking at the soils and the nutrients in the soils and in the year after fire, and then 2 years after fire and how that relates to regeneration and tree seedling mortality. So we don't have results on that yet, but hopefully we will in another year or so.
Great. Okay, that looks like it should do it. Thanks again, Kim. For everyone, as you close the webinar, a brief survey will pop up. So we'd really appreciate and value your feedback and input on potential future webinar topics. And if you have more questions regarding this webinar, or as Kim mentioned, requests for particular sources she presented on, she's kindly provided her contact info on this page, and then my info is to the right if you have any questions about other Northern Rockies fire science events. Thank you everyone for attending today, and thanks again, Kim, for taking the time to share all this interesting work with us. We really appreciate it.
Yeah, well, thanks for having me.
Of course. All right. And thank you again, and have a great rest of your Tuesday, everyone.